There's a moment most beekeepers know. You come back to a hive 5 days after introducing a new queen. You lift the outer cover, find the frame, pull the cage slowly into the light. And she's dead. Curled against the candy plug, attended by nobody, the cage still sealed from the outside. The plug was never touched from the inside. Most beekeepers reach the same conclusion. Bad queen, shipped in poor condition, wrong genetics for that colony. They write it off and order another one. The queen wasn't the problem. In the 1930s, commercial beekeeping operations across Ohio and Indiana were introducing queens at scale, dozens, sometimes more, per season. They tracked outcomes the way any commercial operation tracks what costs money, and across multiple seasons of careful record keeping, a pattern emerged that had nothing to do with queen quality. Acceptance rates varied by one factor. Not the source of the queens, not the genetics of the receiving colony, not the season or the forage. The variable that separated 60% acceptance from acceptance rates consistently above 90% was what the beekeeper did or did not do in the 5 days after the cage went into the hive. There is a window, a specific span of days after introduction during which the colony is working through a biological process that will determine whether that queen lives or dies. That window can be protected or it can be interrupted. Open the hive during that window, even once for a few minutes, and the biology changes. The 1930s commercial beekeepers who understood this window were not working with better queens, better cages, or better information than is available today. They were working with the same biology more carefully. What that biology actually requires, and why modern inspection habits work directly against it, is worth understanding precisely. By the mid-1930s, commercial queen rearing had become an established industry. Mated queens were moving north and east from Georgia and Louisiana to commercial honey producers across the Midwest who depended on requeening as a routine management tool. For a commercial operation managing hundreds of colonies, a queen rejection wasn't a small setback. It was a lost production unit during a period when time and cost were both real. The beekeepers who kept detailed records weren't doing it out of academic interest. Their margins required knowing what worked and what didn't. What those Ohio and Indiana records showed, and what several state apiary extension bulletins from the mid-1930s documented, was a consistent correlation between inspection frequency after introduction and rejection rates. Operations that maintained a strict policy of non-intervention for 5 to 7 days following caging saw consistently higher acceptance. Operations that opened hives before day 5 saw rejection rates 2 to 3 times higher, with the most damaging openings occurring between days 3 and 5. But the queens that failed weren't bad queens. The timing was. To understand why the timing mattered, it is necessary to understand what is actually happening inside that hive during those first 5 days. Most introduction guides stop well short of this explanation. Every established queen produces a complex chemical signal known as Queen Mandibular Pheromone. This blend suppresses worker ovary development, organizes forager behavior, and provides the colony with its primary chemical confirmation of a functioning queen. Workers seek contact with the queen to receive it. They distribute it through food sharing across the entire colony. It is not simply a status signal, it is the chemical identity of the queen, continuously refreshed and continuously circulated. When a queen is removed, QMP levels in the colony drop within hours. The colony detects the absence rapidly. Its behavioral state shifts. Emergency queen cell construction begins if open brood is present. The colony becomes, in a chemical and behavioral sense, alert, primed to evaluate any queen-like signal that enters the hive. A new queen introduced into this state is not accepted immediately. The process is more gradual than that. And gradual is exactly the detail that most introduction guides under-explain. If this kind of biology-first approach to queen management is the kind of content that helps you work with your colonies more precisely, A like on this video helps more experienced beekeepers find it. The cage has two functions that most beekeepers understand well. It protects the queen from immediate attack, and the candy plug provides a timed release. As workers chew through it over several days, time passes for the colony to begin adjusting to her presence. But there is a third function of the cage that the 1930s commercial protocol was built around without ever naming it directly. The cage isn't just protection, it's the classroom. The classroom, during the days the queen spends behind the wire, nurse bees make contact with her through the mesh. They feed her through the wire, they groom her through the wire, and through that sustained contact, they begin acquiring her chemical signature. Not only her mandibular pheromone blend, though that is part of it, but also the complex profile of cuticular hydrocarbons that coats the surface of every bee in the colony and identifies each individual as a member of that specific population. A queen arriving from an outside source carries a different cuticular hydrocarbon profile. She smells, in the precise chemical sense that bees read, like a foreigner. She will continue to carry that foreign signature until she has had enough undisturbed contact with the colony's population to acquire their blend. That process takes days, not hours. It happens through exactly the kind of calm, sustained, low-stress contact that the caged introduction period provides. The nurse bees that attend her through the cage during those first days are not simply feeding her. They are becoming her first cohort of advocates, bees that have begun to recognize her chemical profile and distribute familiarity with it through the colony as they move through their normal routines. This is the process the 1930s protocol was designed to protect. They didn't have that language, but they had learned, season after season, to leave that process undisturbed. The critical period runs from approximately day 3 to day 7. This is when the colony's acceptance decision is forming at a chemical and behavioural level. The accumulated response of thousands of workers to the pheromone profile moving through the hive from the cage. If that process runs undisturbed, the queen's signal gradually normalises. Workers at the cage shift from agitation to attendance. The candy is chewed from the inside by bees that have developed enough familiarity with her to make contact willingly. Open the hive during this period, and you interrupt that process at its most critical point. This is where the 1930s protocol becomes genuinely difficult for the modern beekeeper to follow, because what it requires is something that modern beekeeping culture has almost universally redefined as irresponsible. When a hive is opened, guard bees release alarm pheromone. Isopentyl acetate, the compound that signals threat, mobilizes defensive response and puts the colony into an alert state. In a stable queen-right colony, this alarm response dissipates within minutes after the hive is closed. The colony returns to its normal behavioral state. In a colony that is mid-process in its evaluation of a newly introduced queen, the alarm response does something more damaging. It elevates the colony's defensive sensitivity precisely at the moment it is evaluating a foreign chemical signature. Nurse bees that had been shifting toward acceptance behavior at the cage now respond from a state of arousal rather than calm. The threshold at which they identify the caged queen as foreign drops. The probability of balling through the mesh increases. Every time you open that hive during that window, you reset the clock, not always with immediate visible consequence. Sometimes the colony recovers, the alarm subsides, the acceptance process resumes, the queen emerges on day 6 and is received without hostility. But sometimes, statistically more often than most beekeepers recognize, the disruption tips the balance at a moment when the balance was nearly resolved. The queen is found dead in the cage, or she emerges and is balled within hours on the comb. The beekeeper attributes it to a bad queen, or an aggressive colony, or bad luck. The cause was an inspection made at precisely the wrong biological moment. The 1930s Ohio commercial protocol was straightforward in its mechanics. The discipline it required was the harder part. Queen cage introduced directly between 2 frames of capped brood, not open larvae. capped brood generates heat and nurse bee density without the intense feeding demand that open larvae create. The nurse bees concentrated near capped brood are the precise population that will attend the cage most consistently through the recognition window. Candy plug oriented downward. The timed release works correctly when workers are chewing upward. Gravity extends the process slightly, giving the colony more time in that undisturbed contact phase before emergence. The hive closed, not opened at 48 hours to assess worker behavior. Not opened on day 3 to see whether the candy is being chewed. Not opened on day 4 for any reason short of a genuine emergency. 5 full days as the minimum. 7 as the target for the operations with the highest documented acceptance rates. Natural emergence, without intervention, into a colony that has had a week of undisturbed contact with the queen's chemical profile through the mesh. The 1930s commercial beekeeper didn't open that hive on day 3. He didn't open it on day 5 either. Most contemporary introduction guidance recommends checking the cage at 24 to 48 hours to assess worker behavior. Are the bees calm at the cage? Are they clustering against it? Is the candy being chewed? This guidance is well-intentioned. The problem is that the act of checking is not neutral. It is an intervention in the biology it is trying to observe. The inspection that is meant to confirm whether the introduction is proceeding correctly is correlated, across the documented record, with outcomes in which it proceeds less correctly. The 1930s commercial beekeeper didn't have a philosophical objection to that inspection. He had an economic one. He had observed, season after season, that hives left undisturbed for 5 to 7 days produced more accepted queens than hives opened before that window closed. The outcome data drove the behavior. No theory required. The theory, the pheromone chemistry, the alarm cascade, the cuticular hydrocarbon acquisition process, was confirmed by research that came decades later. It named precisely what the early inspection was disrupting. The biology the 1930s beekeepers observed was not mysterious. It was a chemical process with a specific timeline and a specific vulnerability that their management habits had, through accumulated observation, learned to protect. If this kind of historically grounded biological reasoning is useful to you, this is a good point to subscribe. There's more of it ahead. Here is what the protocol produces in a contemporary apiary when it is followed precisely. Day 7. First full assessment. The hive opened carefully, with attention to minimal disruption near the brood area. What to look for is not the queen herself. Searching for the queen on day 7 risks disturbing a transition that may still be settling. What to look for is evidence of her presence. Eggs in the bottom of cells, single per cell, in the characteristic laying pattern of an established queen beginning her brood cycle. Nurse bees clustered loosely in the brood nest area with the quiet, purposeful orientation they take around a queen they have accepted. The absence of the restless, disorganized movement of a colony in alarm. If those signs are present, the introduction succeeded. The queen emerged naturally, moved through the hive into an environment that had been preparing for her for days, and began her brood cycle in a colony that had not been disrupted during the most chemically sensitive period of the transition. The window the 1930s commercial beekeepers understood. The period of 5 to 7 days during which the acceptance decision is being made, and during which inspection reverses or disrupts that decision, is the same window that the pheromone research of the following decades identifies in precise chemical terms. It is not a tradition for its own sake. It is a biological process with a specific timeline, specific chemistry, and specific vulnerability to disruption. The difference in acceptance rates wasn't the queen's, it was what happened after the cage went in. The reason this protocol disappeared from standard beekeeping advice follows a pattern this channel has documented before. The post-war commercial expansion produced a management culture built around active intervention, regular inspection, systematic treatment, scheduled requeening. A protocol requiring 7 days of non-action was not easily packaged as responsible guidance. It generated no product sales, It required no equipment. It required a specific kind of discipline that is genuinely difficult to convey in a publication whose audience is inclined, by nature, toward engagement with their hives. By the 1960s and 1970s, the 48-hour check had become normalized, not because it worked better, because it fit the inspection-oriented management culture that the commercial expansion of American beekeeping had produced. The correlation between early inspection and elevated rejection rates was not discussed prominently, because doing so would have required acknowledging that a widely recommended practice was contributing to a widely experienced problem. The biology has not changed. The recognition window has not shifted. The alarm pheromone cascade that hive opening triggers inside that window still disrupts the same chemical process in the same way. The only thing that changed was what management culture defined as attentiveness. The 1930s commercial beekeeper who left his cages in for 7 days was not being careless. He was not being inattentive. He was doing the hardest thing in practical beekeeping, recognizing when the correct management decision is to stay out of the biology and let it proceed. Patience isn't passive, it's the method. The method. Fiveing Worcestershire war sauce. The method. Fiving the fiving of the method. The next time a queen is found dead in a cage, it is worth asking one question before placing the replacement order. Not what was wrong with the queen, whether the hive was opened before the window closed. That question, asked honestly, changes what happens the next time a cage goes in. Not the queen, not the cage. The calendar that determines when the hive is opened again. If this kind of reasoning changes how you approach a queen introduction, leave a comment with what you've seen in your own hives. The patterns that experienced beekeepers carry across seasons are worth more than any single explanation. Subscribe, there's more of this kind of precision ahead. The kind built not from theory, but from the same patient observation that told those Ohio beekeepers to put down the hive tool and walk away.